Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation today. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Eric Shelter. I'm the director of the Center for Sustainable Separations of Metals, which is a Phase 1 National Science Foundation Center for Chemical Innovation. The goals of the center are to develop new sustainable chemistry associated with mining practices, and also to enable new chemistry for recycling of critical metals that are essential in technology. If you're interested in the work of the center, you can check us out on the website, which I've posted here in the chat. One of the key components of the activities of CSSM is professional development activities for our trainees and for wider members of the community. So it's in that context that we are having our discussion today with our distinguished speaker, Dr. Sibrina Collins, who's the Executive Director of the Marburger STEM Center at Lawrence Tech in Southfield, Michigan, in southeastern Lower Michigan. I'm going to do a quick intro for Sibrina before I pass it over to her. So Dr. Collins is an inorganic chemist, yay, inorganic chemist, and a STEM administrator. She is a proud Detroit Public Schools graduate and began her career at Highland Park Community College in Highland Park, Michigan, where she earned an Associate of Science degree in 1990. Dr. Collins later earned a BA in chemistry cum laude in 1994 from Wayne State University in Detroit. Dr. Collins earned her MS and PhD both in inorganic chemistry at The Ohio State University under the direction of Professor Bruce Burston. As a grad student at OSU, she received significant training as a photochemist, where she used light to study chemical reactions and reactive molecules. Dr. Collins later completed a postdoctoral appointment at Louisiana State University, where she focused on heart disease research. Dr. Collins has held faculty positions at Claflin University and HBCU in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and the College of Wooster in Wooster, Ohio. Dr. Collins has worked as a writer and editor for the AAAS in Washington, D.C., and served as the Director of Graduate Diversity Recruiting for the University of Washington in Seattle. Dr. Collins previously served as a Director of Education at the Charles Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, which is a cultural institution focused on African American experience. Over the course of her career, Dr. Collins has mentored 17 undergraduate chemistry students and published peer-reviewed articles in a number of high-impact journals such as Inorganic Chemistry, Journal of Chemical Education, Acticris, and the Bulletin for the History of Chemistry and Nature. Dr. Collins is now the founding executive director of the Marburger STEM Center at Lawrence Tech. The Marburger STEM Center is the intellectual home of the campus-wide STEM initiatives at Lawrence Tech, which provides inclusiveness, excellence, creativity, and innovation. And the title of the presentation today is Superhero Science, the Importance of Storytelling in Chemical Education. I would encourage everyone throughout the course of the presentation to post your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time at the end of the seminar for discussion. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Dr. Collins. It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to you about your really fascinating work. And we're really excited to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen. Let me get this in slideshow mode. Everybody good? Can see that?
Yep.
All right. So I'm delighted to be here to have this conversation about superhero science. And in the second part of my presentation, I will talk about vibranium, which we do know is a metal that's not real. But I want to assure everyone that I really do investigate actual elements on the periodic table. And this is my proof of that. This is a recent publication that was published last year in the Chemical Educator. It's a collaboration with two of my former students from the College of Wooster, where we synthesized 5 different transition metal complexes and then evaluated them against lung cancer cell lines. And so my former student, Kyle Cohen, who was a double major in chemistry and French, and now is a patent attorney in New York, making all kinds of money. He was lucky enough to grow X-ray quality crystals of two of his copper compounds. And these are actually gorgeous, like violet, blue, purple, just absolutely gorgeous. And you know, you have to pray to the crystal gods, right, to get an X-ray quality crystal. And it turns out that first compound, which kind of has that octahedral geometry around that copper metal center, actually exhibits modest anti-cancer behavior. So this is my proof that I play with real elements on the periodic table. And in my previous life, as Eric mentioned, so I did graduate work with Bruce Burston at the Ohio State University. And so I focused on the photochemistry of three different ruthenium dinuclear organometallic complexes. And this ruthenium has such rich chemistry, just so pleased that I was able to focus on this as a graduate student. So there you go. I'm really an inorganic chemist, and I play with vibranium now. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Lawrence Tech, so it's a small private institution located about 20 minutes from my hometown in Detroit. And so, you know, today, you know, the acronym STEM is essentially a buzzword, but it's deeply embedded in the DNA of Lawrence Tech when it was established back in 1932, adjacent to Henry Ford's Model T factory. So if you are ever in Southeast Michigan, once we get past this pandemic, you have an open invitation to come hang out with me at Lawrence Tech. So our conversation today, I want to kind of begin a little bit by sharing why diversity in STEM should matter to all of us, not just to women and people of color. And then I have some selected profiles of some STEM pioneers in chemistry, math, physics, and biology. And then I'll kind of tell you what we're doing now to bring in the next generation. Excuse me. So let me begin by telling a story. So several years ago, I was a graduate student in the Department of Chemistry at the Ohio State University, and I was one of 8 African-American students enrolled in the graduate program. And so Ohio State on average has about maybe 200 graduate students, so we had a critical mass. And at the time, the department chair, Matt Platts, invited us all out for lunch at the faculty club. Now, in hindsight, we were just excited to be getting some free food, right? So this idea of getting free food never gets old, whether you're an undergraduate, grad, postdoc, or faculty. Free food is free food. So we go to the faculty club and we have a candid conversation about equity and inclusion in chemistry. And he said to us, tell us what we need to do to keep you here. And he was really sincere, wanted all of us to succeed. And so ever since that day, I've kind of been on this journey to understand why so few women and people of color pursue careers in STEM and in chemistry in particular. So African Americans, women and people of color have always contributed, right, to the STEM fields, and which is one of the reasons why I'm sharing this, I think, this amazing vintage photo from Spelman College. It was around 1890. As I look at this photo, I cringe a little bit because nobody is wearing safety goggles, but safety goggles were not a thing back then as they are now. And I look at this photo and I just wonder what kinds of career paths were available for these women back then, because we know there were limited opportunities during that time. And it's far more opportunities for women today. And so there was a paper published in 2015 that basically looked at 5 statistics that explain why STEM diversity should matter to all of us. Even though this was published in 2015, I think it's still relevant. One of the key things that they mentioned, key points, stats, was that they estimated the size of the STEM workforce in the US to be over like 8.5 million people. Well, the National Science Foundation estimates that the science and engineering workforce is between anywhere from 6 million to 23 million. So the take home message is that's a lot of jobs. That's very important, tremendously important to the US economy, right? Secondly, you know, the STEM workforce is not really reflective our US changing demographics. And also research is pretty clear that when you have diverse research teams, you have an increase in a number of patents filed by diverse teams, so that's very clear. This percentage drop in the number of women earning computer science degrees, what I don't have a real sense of at this point is how programs, you have a number of programs now, such as Girls Who Code, Black Girls Code, and those kinds of things. I don't know what the impact of that has been in terms of eventually students, women, young women going on and earning degrees in computer science. It may be still too early, right, to see the impact of that. So what I hope is that we'll see, more women actually pursuing those types of degrees. But we still do have, obviously, a salary gap between men and women in STEM careers. So this is why, these 5 stats, I think, is really, really emphasizes the significance and the importance of diversity and inclusion, really, in the STEM disciplines. And data, released by the National Science Foundation underscores that it's challenging to address equity in science and engineering occupations. For example, African-American women and men represent 5% of the science and engineers, but 13% of the US population, right? So it's so you can make similar arguments with Hispanic men and women or Native Americans as well, and it's imperative of all of us really to do what we can to address equity in STEM and equity in chemistry. And the way I address it is through storytelling. And the story of African Americans earning PhDs in chemistry actually begins with Dr. St. Elmo Brady. And I will admit to you, one of the reasons why I love talking about him so much is because I think he was tremendously handsome. I know that's rather shallow, but it's it's the truth. I do think he was incredibly handsome. But he was a native of Louisville, Kentucky, earned his undergraduate degree from Fisk University and HBCU in Tennessee. Then later was admitted to University of Illinois, earning his master's degree in chemistry. 2 years later, earned his PhD in chemistry in 1916, becoming the first African American to earn a doctorate in the United States in chemistry. And although that's a wonderful historical fact, that's not why he matters. He matters because of his scientific contributions, just like anyone else. And in fact, his dissertation really focused on the influence of carbonyl groups on the acidity of carboxylic acids. So if you think about these long chain, carboxylic acids, what happens when you have a carbonyl group at the alpha position or the beta or gamma position. And that was pretty important to organic chemistry and carboxylic acids during that time. But he held a number of faculty positions at HBCUs, Tuskegee, Howard, where he served as department chair. Then he returned to Fisk and he served as department chair as well. But he had heavy teaching loads, did not have access to state-of-the-art facilities to conduct research. But nevertheless, he did publish an article in JACS in 1939 when he was on the faculty at Fisk University. The story of African-American women earning PhDs in chemistry begins with Dr. Marie Maynard Daly. She was a native of Corona, New York, earned her undergraduate degree from Queens College, her master's degree in 1943. And then in 1948, she became the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in chemistry in the United States. And again, that's a great historical fact, but that's not why she's important. In fact, in the 1950s, she investigated the relationship between cholesterol and heart attacks. And we know to this very day that pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money, on drugs to treat cardiovascular disease. That's why she matters. And I do understand that the mere fact that here she earned her PhD in 1947, 1948, several years after Dr. St. Elmo Brady, really speaks volumes about the opportunities for women, right, during that time period. Another trailblazer in chemistry is Alice Augusta Ball. And she was a native of Seattle, Washington, earned 2 undergraduate degrees from University of Washington in pharmaceutical chemistry and then pharmacy. Then she went on and earned her master's degree in chemistry from the College of Hawaii, which is now the University of Hawaii, and then joined the faculty. So she was the first woman and African-American to do that. And so that's a wonderful accomplishment, but I think some of her other career highlights are a lot more significant. One is that she actually co-authored a paper in JAX in 1914 with her research mentor at University of Washington. That is pretty significant and it's highly unusual that an African-American woman would actually co-author a JAX paper during that time period. So this is 2 years before St. Elmo Brady earned his doctorate from University of Illinois. So that's pretty remarkable. But one of the key reasons why she's significant is because she developed the first viable treatment for leprosy or Hansen's disease, which it damages the nerves, and often patients who suffer from this condition end up having their fingers and toes amputated, and it's a really debilitating disease. But during her time, it was a public health crisis. They actually had these like leprosy colonies where they were sending people, and there was a race to try to find a cure. And so she was able to actually develop a first viable treatment, and it was utilized well into the 1940s. But she didn't actually see the impact of her work. She died in 1916 at the age of 24 as a result of chlorine gas, inhaling chlorine gas. She was trying to give a demonstration in the classroom. And so, but she was honored by the University of Hawaii in 2000 and 2007. And most recently, there's been a short film called The Ball Method that's available on Amazon Prime that talks about her career. And so she is pretty significant. Another trailblazer, particularly in biology, is Dr. Jewel Plummer Cobb. And what she represents really is that career trajectory from being a professor and then working your way up all the way to being president of an R1 institution. So she was a native of Chicago, earned her undergraduate degree from Talladega College, which is an HBCU, then her master's degree and her PhD from New York University in biology. She's had so many appointments, awards, too many to name, but one of the things I do want to highlight is that she was a prolific cancer researcher during her time, publishing in high impact journals. When she graduated from New York University, she received a postdoctoral fellowship, and she actually worked at Harlem Hospital, which was led at that time by Dr. Lewis T. Wright. So she was able to collaborate with Dr. Wright and his daughter, Dr. Jane C. Wright, who was also a trailblazer in cancer research. And then in 1981, she became president of California State Fullerton, which is an R1 institution. And so that's pretty remarkable because you don't have a lot of women serving as presidents, right, of R1 institutions. So that's pretty significant. One of the reasons why I love talking about Dr. Evelyn Boyd Granville is that she has connections to the film Hidden Figures. And I actually love that movie, Hidden Figures. And so she's still alive. She's a native of Washington, D.C., earned her undergraduate degree in Smith College, and then her PhD in math from Yale University. And so she was the second African-American woman to earn a PhD in math. And she also held a faculty appointment at Fisk University. She co-authored a textbook. So she's done a number of things in her career. And I just want to highlight a couple. One is that she was on the staff of IBM, the International Business Machines, and then later a research specialist for North American Aviation Company. And what's significant about that is both IBM and NAA were awarded NASA contracts. So NASA was outsourcing some of this computational work. So she was able to complete calculations for 3 space-related projects, Project Vanguard, Project Mercury, and Project Apollo. And so she was able to use her background really to help put mankind in space, right? So that was a huge, huge societal impact. And one of the things that we've done here at Lawrence Tech, so I had the opportunity to collaborate with an amazing student, Maria Torres Lopez, a media communications major. She graduated in 2019. She actually wrote, directed, and produced a 30-minute student film entitled Women Untold. So if you go to YouTube, type in Women Untold, you'll be able to access it. And it tells the story of Alice Augusta Ball, Jill Plummer Cobb, and Evelyn Boyd Granville. And we're kind of using this as an educational tool or a pedagogical tool, if you will, to address equity in the classroom. Now, the story of African Americans making contributions to physics, well, earning PhDs in physics actually begins with Dr. Edward Boucher. He was a native of New Haven, Connecticut, earned his undergraduate degree from Yale, and then 2 years later earned his PhD, becoming the first African-American to earn a doctorate in any field, and it just so happened to be in physics. And you would think that someone that earned a PhD in physics from Yale would have a few job opportunities, but that was not the case during that time period. He was not hired by predominantly white institutions, but he wasn't hired by HBCUs either. And the reason for that is because HBCUs during that time, the majority of them had a curriculum focused on vocational training or industrial training, meaning that they were training students to be carpenters and cooks and those kinds of things. So someone with a PhD in physics doesn't necessarily fit, right, that curriculum. But nevertheless, he taught, he was employed, a faculty member at the Institute for Colored Youth for 26 years, where he taught chemistry and physics. But in 1902, he was forced to leave his job because of the ongoing public debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois over this idea of industrial education versus a traditional college education. And during that time, Booker T. Washington was going around the country giving speeches about the importance of vocational training and specifically trying to raise money for Tuskegee. The administration at the Institute for Colored Youth kind of sided with Booker T. Washington, and so they decided to get rid of Dr. Boucher and other educators on staff. And so he ended up having a number of different career paths, well, opportunities, I would say, where he worked as a science teacher, and eventually his last position, he was a principal at a high school in Ohio. So he didn't have the, you know, he made this tremendous career milestone, earning his doctorate, but because of the barriers that were placed in front of him, he was never able to conduct cutting edge research. He didn't publish, you know, and it's kind of a tragic story. But the second African-American to earn a doctorate in physics had a very different career, Professor Elmer Eames. So he was a native of Memphis, Tennessee, earned his undergraduate degree from Fisk, and then his master's and his PhD from the University of Michigan. And as I said, he had a very different career. So he was able to actually publish a couple of papers in high impact physics journals at the time. He worked as a chemist and engineer, and then he returned to Fisk, serving as department chair until he passed away in 1941. But I ran across some comments from the late John Marburger, who was a physicist and actually the science advisor for President Bush. And he talked about the significance of Elmer Eames. And so Dr. Marburger was on campus giving some remarks about Elmer Eames, and he provided some historical context. So I'm not going to go through all of his comments, but one of the things he said was, in 1913, Niels Bohr had introduced this idea of the model for the atom, and at that time, his model was not widely accepted by the scientific community, right? And so here you have, just a few years later, you have Elmer Eames providing that tangible evidence of quantum behavior and vibrating systems, and which was really important because prior to that, quantum theory was just really an idea, it was a theory. But so if you have, so I come from the perspective of it's absolutely important when you talk about quantum theory, you talk about the importance and significance of Albert Einstein, you talk about Niels Bohr, but Elmer Eames needs to be a part of that conversation too. And one of my heroes is in inorganic chemistry is Professor Gregory Robinson. I just think he's a brilliant inorganic chemist. He's a native of Alabama, state of Alabama, earned his undergraduate degree from Jacksonville State University. And he was a football player also during that time, and then earned his PhD from University of Alabama in 1984. So his career has been in academia, where he spent 10 years on the faculty at Clemson University before joining University of Georgia, where he is today, and he's a distinguished professor of chemistry. Now, Professor Robinson has way too many accolades for me to even mention. I just wanted to highlight that, you know, in 2017, he was a fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, which is pretty significant, has hundreds of papers and many journals such as JACS, Nature Chemistry, Organometallics. But I first learned about his work in the late 1990s. So around 1997, 1998, I was in my third and fourth year of graduate school at Ohio State. And he had published two groundbreaking papers on some unusual main group molecules, particularly the galline and the ferrogalline. So some of you may remember this. And it actually played out in chemical and engineering news. It was like a soap opera, in my opinion. And so for any graduate students or postdocs who are watching, one of the reasons why this is so important, because Professor Robinson really took a risk, you know, in his doing this research and publishing these papers. And so the idea was, you know, the takeaway is, you know, what he was proposing was this triple bond between these metal atoms. And when he proposed this, it was not widely accepted by some members of the chemistry community. Just like I kind of related to Niels Bohr, him producing, you know, his model not being widely accepted by the community. But I was so moved by this research, and I was thinking as a grad student, wow, this is someone from my community, and he's challenging our thinking about metal-metal bonding. I just thought that was so awesome. And so as a result of that, it made such an impact on me. Later, when I was a faculty member at the College of Worcester, I developed a case study where my students in the class, they had to read his two papers, then also read these articles in Chemical and Engineering News. And basically they had to present the argument for if these molecules had a single bond, a double bond, or a triple bond. And it was just a really fun experience. Because I believe in not only talking about the discoveries, but telling the stories of the scientists behind those discoveries. And so I was able to recently publish an article in Nature Chemistry in January of this year, where I talk about Greg's work and how you can use that in the classroom to engage students. I also talk about the work of Dr. Percy Julian as well, who was a genius, you know, in my opinion. And most recently, last month, PBS screened the documentary Forgotten Genius. And if you haven't seen it, it's a really brilliant documentary about Dr. Percy Julian. And Dr. Julian, this man had over 100 registered patents, I believe over 100 peer-reviewed publications. Can you imagine what more he could have contributed to society if he didn't have these racist barriers placed in front of him? You know, it's all about everyone having access to the lab bench and a seat at the table as well. So it's a brilliant documentary. So what are we doing now to really encourage or inspire the next generation of STEM professionals and chemists? So I serve as executive director of the Marburger STEM Center at Lawrence Tech, and you can kind of think of it as the clearinghouse or the umbrella of all of the STEM activities that we have on our campus. So that includes our high school summer camps, Extreme Science Saturdays, which also targets middle school students and high school students. And we have partnerships with a number of organizations and school districts around the state. And so we have three key focus areas: supporting current LTU faculty and staff. That's obviously our first priority. Second is that public engagement or community engagement piece, which I'll talk about, and then industry connections. And so our summer camps play a really important role. It's a high yielding program. Nearly 50% of students that participate in these summer camps actually enroll at Lawrence Tech towards a degree. So it's very important for our enrollment. We offer nearly 30 different summer camps across all 4 of LTU's colleges. So including, starting your own business, the entrepreneurial mindset, molecules of medicine, automotive engineering is very popular, obviously, because we're so close, obviously, to the big 3 being here in Michigan. And molecules of medicine, biomedical engineering, you name it, we do it. And so the students have a chance to either have a residential experience or a commuter experience. And so they can live in the college dorms for a week, get that experience about what it's like to be a college student. Prior to the pandemic happening, we were delivering in-person workshops, but like all of you, we had to pivot and deliver activities online. And so one particular recent workshop was focused on the chemistry of baking cakes and cupcakes. And so our STEM outreach coordinator, Jacqueline Smith, led this workshop with middle school students who were at home. I'm not sure if their parents really liked the kids being in the kitchen baking, and messing up the kitchen, but they still had fun and they were very proud of their final products. And so, you have a discussion about the roles of each of the ingredients, milk, eggs, that sort of thing. But also it's important that you have a teachable moment right in there. So we talked to the students about the importance of monitoring your sugar intake and diabetes, because you want to make sure that you're connecting to student experiences. And unfortunately, some students either know someone that suffers from diabetes or they suffer from it themselves, right? So we try to make connections to real experiences. And most recently, I collaborated with Dr. Sean Hitchcock, who's an organic chemistry professor at Illinois State University. So we created this bonus assignment for organic chemistry students, where they have to evaluate the chemical structure of one of the compounds being evaluated for treating the coronavirus. Because one thing is clear, right? This pandemic that's impacting all of us is showing in real time why chemistry matters, right? Why STEM matters. But what we also do is use movies to try to engage the next generation. So let me give you the backstory on how we actually ended up publishing this Black Panther vibranium and the periodic table. And what I can tell you is, prior to the film being released in February 2018, I was not a fan of Marvel Comics. I was not reading comic books. And I actually had no plans on seeing the film, but my sister encouraged me to go see it. And usually when I'm watching a movie or a television show, I can't shut off my chemistry brain. I'm always trying to look for some sort of connection. So I go to the movies, February of 2018, with 2 of my younger cousins, and I'm enjoying this film. And it occurs to me that this fictional African nation, Wakanda, is thriving on the production and use of this element called vibranium. And as I'm watching this film, I kept saying, okay, if it were real, where would it be in the periodic table? And I could not stop thinking about the question. That's what we chemists do, right? We come up with these questions that we think are interesting and needs an answer. So to make a long story short, I go home that night. I start writing out what I thought this paper should look like. Sent an email to my colleague, Professor Appleby. I said, hey, have you seen this film? And can you ask this as a bonus question on your next general chemistry exam? And she did. We found out immediately who the Marvel comic fans were in the department. We used some of their responses to craft the paper, and we submitted it for publication. And initially, I was reluctant to submit it because I wasn't sure if the editor would actually send it out for peer review. But the editor did, and we got great reviews, and it was published in June of 2018. And this is the actual question, but the students were asked to propose what the elemental symbol should be, electron configuration, oxidation states, and where they thought the element should fit. And the majority of the students indicated that they thought it should fit either with the transition metals or with the lanthanides and actinides, which I agree with. But there is no right or wrong answer. You can make an argument that it belongs in the S block, if you want. The point is, we were just trying to leverage the popularity of the movie to get students to think seriously about the periodic table. So once it was published, I shared it on Twitter And it kind of exploded a little bit to my surprise. I want to just share a few responses. This one is probably my favorite. Forget Infinity War. This is the best crossover ever. And I saw that. I was like, okay, wow, this is connecting, to folks. This response here, this post, really gets to the heart of what we were doing, taking a holistic approach and thinking about the properties of the elements. But one of the points that we make at the end of this paper is that Black Panther provides an opportunity to have a national conversation about the important contributions of women and people of color in STEM. Because the character Shuri, she resonated with a lot of young people, and is an example of what's possible when everybody has access, right? When you have a place at the table and a place at the lab bench. We had a faculty member in Brazil tweet about us. So now we have this international connection. And it's always awesome when your PhD advisor gives you a shout out on Twitter and you have not been in the lab breaking glassware. So I thought I did a good thing. And I broke a lot of glassware as a grad student, but I did finish. But what was really interesting is that chemistry faculty started sharing ideas about other chemistry concepts that I wasn't thinking about at the time. Someone asked, okay, so what's the half-life of vibranium? So now you can make some connections to radioactive decay concepts or relativistic effects, right? Which help explain these unusual properties that we see in these heavier elements, or material science. The point is you can design an entire curriculum using a film like this as a hook. So for the graduate students or postdocs who are watching, or the faculty, think about your favorite television shows or movies and see if you can make some connections to content that you're discussing in class, kind of as a hook, right? To engage engage students. This question here is probably one of my favorites from Dr. Tom Kutzelman, who teaches at Spring Arbor University here in Michigan. He said, wouldn't it be cool if vibranium had electrons in the 5G subshell? And so I diving into literature. So it turns out that the 5G subshell, so we're talking after the F orbitals, okay? So the 5G subshell begins to fill with element 125. So element 125, now you're talking about the 8th period of the periodic table. And so 50 years ago, you had theoretical chemists and physicists basically predicting the properties of these unknown elements. So I'm showing here the proposed electron configurations for element 125. Now, since we are currently in the Marvel universe, let's say element 125 is vibranium. So if you lose all of those electrons, +7 oxidation state, which, okay, is interesting. But I think what's a more interesting question is asking students to propose the possible quantum numbers for a 5G electron, right? So getting them to think beyond the 7th period of the periodic table. And honestly, for me, as I, when we were writing this paper, I was thinking it would be a cool way for faculty to talk about the chemistry of the lanthanides and actinides. Because often in general chemistry, the only thing that we tell students is, when we talk about the periodic table, oh yeah, those 2 rows at the bottom, that's where the F block is. And then we don't say anything else about it, so, and there's a lot of rich chemistry there. So, that was my thinking initially with this idea. So we were interviewed by the fabulous Linda Wang at Chemical and Engineering News for the news script section. And so I often use Chemical and Engineering News to teach. We were interviewed by a journalist from Wired, which has a much more broad readership audience. Then we were given a shout out in Bloomberg Opinion. We were not interviewed for this article, but the author mentioned us in the very last paragraph, how we were making connections to real science content using this film. And this is the first time I've ever kind of been connected to the Oscars. So I think that's, a pretty cool thing. What I discovered recently, though, is that there is a journal entitled Superhero Science and Technology, and it was established back in 2017 by Dr. Barry Fitzgerald, who's a physicist, and he's currently living in the Netherlands. So I've had a couple of Zoom calls with him, I wanted to know specifically why he established this journal in the first place. So he wanted to provide a space for educators and students that love superhero science to publish their work. And so he cited the Black Panther paper in his editorial, and there's a call for papers to remember the late Chadwick Boseman. So for students, if you love superhero science, this might be a place for you to publish some of your work. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was not a fan of comic books or Marvel comics prior to seeing the film. I'm currently teaching a social science seminar course with no chemistry major, so this makes it real interesting for me. And one of my colleagues suggested that I use a graphic novel to teach. So this is the first time that I actually tried this. And so the graphic novel that we focused on is Batman Contagion. And so this was originally published in 1996. So it's like, I think 12 comic books. And it's all about this flu-like virus that's attacking the residents of Gotham City. And there's this race to find a cure. So it is timely, it is graphic, and it was fun to read. And my students were required to write an essay. And one of the students said, reading a book about a pandemic during a pandemic is really ironic, which it was. And we had a lot of we had basically student-led discussions. And so I kind of used Google Docs as a way to try to get students to engage them remotely. And so every student in the class had to provide at least one question based on the reading. And so one of the questions, how does Robin compare to the frontline and essential workers fighting COVID-19? I just thought that was a creative question. And this is why I love hanging around students. They just think about things very differently, and so this is a lot of fun. Another book that we're using for the class, and we just completed reading this, is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. And what's interesting is that her legacy is still being, is still going on, because as of 2020, the HeLa cells were actually used focusing on research about the coronavirus, COVID-19. So her legacy still goes on and still matters. Now, last year, I had the opportunity to publish a book chapter in a new ACS Symposium book series, Inorganic Chemistry, Vibranium, and Marvel Studios' Black Panther. And so this is an amazing 2-volume set. And I'm just delighted to be in the company of such amazing inorganic chemists. So if you haven't seen this, I encourage you to read it. But I dedicated my book chapter to the memory of Chadwick Boseman, simply because of his awesome portrayal of T'Challa and Black Panther, and because the film made such an impact on me personally and professionally. So in this book chapter, it's really a summary of how we've used this film to make connections with students and engage them. Now, I'm currently serving for the first time as an editor of a forthcoming book entitled African American Chemists, Academia, Industry, and Social Entrepreneurship. So it's more than just a history book. One of the things that we're providing are lesson plans at the end of each chapter for faculty to use in the classroom. So it's a way to basically, it's storytelling, but it's a way to also broaden the image of a chemist in the classroom. So we're on track to publish online by June of 2021, maybe earlier, but June of this year is when it should first be published online. And so the image of on the cover was designed by a graphic artist major here at Lawrence Tech. And so he was inspired by Spider-Man and Black Panther when he came up with the image. And so in my mind, that's a sky bridge leading to a brand new chemistry facility that produces vibranium for the entire world. And finally, for the students who are watching, we often tell you to simply identify your passions, and that'll help you figure out your career path. So I want you to dig a little bit deeper than that and ask yourself some reflective questions. Ask yourself, what kind of impact do you want to make in your neighborhood, in your community, and in the world? And when you do that, when you answer those questions, you'll figure out what your passions are and walk in your purpose. Because honestly, the majority of us spend our entire lives trying to figure out what your purpose actually is. So you're young enough where you can, you got time to figure that out. So if you try to answer those questions today, 5-10 years from now, your answer may be different. So just start thinking about those kinds of things right now. And with that, I just want to close by saying what I hope you take from this conversation is that I think storytelling is a very powerful pedagogical tool to address equity in STEM and in chemistry. And Marvel Studios, the Black Panther. So Black Panther and Vibranium are really, for me, two very inspiring protagonists, telling an amazing story. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is good for business. Research shows that when you have more diverse teams, there's an increase in innovation and creativity. And with that, I thank you. And so I just, I'm active on Twitter. That's my email address. So I look forward to just seeing you on social media and actually also answering any questions that you may have at this time. So thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Collins, for that really inspiring presentation. So I want to encourage everyone, and thanks. Yeah, let's all show our appreciation with our.
Thank you very much.
In Zoom. But I also want to encourage everyone at this point to post their questions in the chat. I'm also going to allow folks to unmute and ask questions if they want. You can use the raise hand feature. You can also turn on your video to do that if you prefer that. But now is our opportunity to ask some follow-up questions to Dr. Collins about the presentation that we've heard. I can happily start the discussion if everyone would be a little bit shy to start things off, but sure. So I had a couple of questions. I thought that was really interesting, important, and inspiring.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a couple of things. So I really appreciate the points about Black Panther providing an opportunity to talk about people of color and women in STEM, as you said, and thinking about television and movies as a hook for curricula for students in our introductory courses, for example. I think that, we have to reach students. That's our job, right? As educators, is to find a way to make those connections with people.
Right.
And so there's work that we have to do beyond just knowing what we're going to say in a lecture on a given day.
Right.
My question is, have you identified in the course of this work other kind of touchstone pieces? I mean, Black Panther and the Marvel universe is such a huge thing for students these days. Are there other ones that we can maybe think about as educators to be looking at? So, I mean, I guess for myself, like, I'm not really up on, all the kind of entertainment options that students have these days. So if there are other ones that you think would be a good example to let people know to try and make those connections.
Yes, sure. And actually, that's a great question. And, as you were talking, I thought about what I was teaching about 10 years ago. I was teaching second semester general chemistry, and we were focused on electrochemistry, which we know is not an easy topic to teach. And it's also not an easy topic for students to necessarily grasp either, particularly when you're talking about balance and redox reactions under basic and acidic conditions. I like doing that kind of stuff, but not everybody else. But as I was preparing my lecture, the textbook that I had at the time had an image of an MP3 player. So we all know that iPods are vintage devices now, but they were real popular 10, 11 years ago. And so I decided I was going to use that as my hook. So I went into class that day and I said, okay, the title of my lecture is what's in your iPod? Who's in your playlist? And so we had two playlists on the board, my playlist and their playlist. And so they were naming these artists that I hadn't heard of, New Direction. You know, they were saying they were really excited about that band. And they laughed when I said I sometimes listen to rappers like Snoop Doggy Dogg or Beyonce, but I had them. They were so engaged. And I said, okay, so we talked about who you like to listen to. How does the iPod work? I said, it's got a battery, right? And so that's how we started talking about reviewing the common oxidation states for the elements. And then I had an activity where they had to balance redox reactions. And so, so I didn't change the content. I just changed kind of how I delivered it, you know, and because they were so engaged, I decided to write it up and submit it to JChem-Ed, and it was accepted as a publication. And so that's kind of how I had that aha moment. Okay, this is a different way to teach. So even though, you know, iPods aren't popular, you can do something similar with a phone. You know, everybody listens to music on their phones, you know, so that's kind of how I, you know, kind of how I approach it. I've used rap and music to try to engage high school students. So that's kind of my, you know, my approach. And inspiration can come from anywhere, you know, so to reach them. So it's not changing the content, but just grabbing some sort of a hook, you know, that'll keep them interested, because it's all about making sure that students have that persistence and that grit, and they want to stick with it and continue to learn, you know, these challenging concepts. I think that's really the key.
Yeah, that's really important. Absolutely. A number of our CSSM colleagues are talking about elements in the chat and kind of making connections with comics and elements, including things like adamantium, I guess, from Wolverine, and also Spider-Man being a paragon of STEM stuff. So, okay, great. Well, we have an opportunity here for more questions.
I have a question.
George, go ahead.
Yeah, so you talked about these historical figures, all very interesting. And you know, it seems like there was sort of, you know, many of them went to HBCUs, and then they also went to major universities. I guess I was interested in your thoughts on, you know, to what extent were the HBCUs really, you know, played a big role in you know, making their careers. Is that still the case now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That is still the case now. But you know, back then, so the majority of HBCUs are in the southern states, and so at that time, you know, African Americans could not be admitted to these, you know, predominantly white institutions down south. So what they would end up doing, they would earn their undergraduate degrees at an HBCU, then they would come up north, right? In a lot of cases. End up earning PhDs from Ohio State or Purdue, you know, University of Chicago. And that was pretty much the pattern. And in fact, at one time, I want to say Ohio State, University of Chicago, and Iowa State were the top three in terms of chemistry, you know, during, I think up until like maybe 1965 or something like that for doctorates. So I do think it's still that's the pattern that you still see. Obviously, you have more students of color attending, you know, other institutions. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's George, you're absolutely right. That was a typical pattern. You had a number of students would earn their undergraduate degrees at HBCUs, then they would go to the larger institutions that earn their doctorates.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot.
We have a question from Professor Christopher Graves.
Hi, yeah. I am really interested in sort of the book you're writing now of highlighting African-American scientists. And I wonder if you've ever thought about developing exercises for students to really dig through the literature and sort of map on these contributions on top of what many of us learn from the sort of whitewashing of the science history. Like, have you ever thought of actively engaging the students in that discovery? Because I think that would be really impactful.
No, that's a great question, and a really good strategy. And so I can tell you some of the activities, the lesson plans actually focus on the literature, and so getting students to dive into the literature and making connections to concepts that they've learned in class. And, others focus on having students develop design experiments and, carry out some results and maybe put together a creative infographic, right, to share their work with their peers. So, yeah, but, Chris, your point about creating something specifically focused on the literature, I think is a great idea. And the literature is so vast, right? You can focus on absolutely every chemistry concept using, the literature. So I agree. It's you got some rich resources out there right at our fingertips, with the literature. That's a great point.
Other questions for Dr. Collins? I mean, I think one of the awesome takeaways for me from your remarks here today are about putting people in touch with sort of resources and materials in which they can incorporate some of these lessons in their curricula. So I really appreciate that. I mean, so something that we sometimes hear is there's an interest from colleagues about trying to include examples of Black scientists, Black chemists in the curricula, but there's this always, you also hear from folks like, well, there isn't time to sort of be adding more things to the lessons. And so what do you tell people who say that, that there just isn't time to be adding more stuff? I'd love to do it, but there isn't time.
Yeah, I do agree, particularly, like in the general chemistry classes, you're trying to cover so much content to prepare students for the second semester general chemistry. One of the things that I've done in my advanced courses, so for inorganic chemistry, I would bring in biographical profiles, of other scientists. So, because oftentimes in the textbook, they're talking about the pioneers, right, in inorganic chemistry or whatever. So those stories are being told. And so what I would typically do, along with sharing that story, okay, here's another individual, that's done some work in the field as well. That way, if you're able to do that, it doesn't take away too much time, to actually do that. There was an article that I also read that was published a couple of years ago, where they created this homework assignment for students to learn about the backgrounds of some of the scientists that they were talking about in class. So this way, it wasn't taking away a lot of time in class, but the students actually had to complete an assignment. So it's a self-discovery, right, type of approach. So so I do hear that, I got so much stuff to cover. When am I going to fit this in? There's a way that you can, do it. And I think creating like these bonus homework assignments is one way to do that. But the other two is inviting, faculty, to give a presentation. How cool would it be, right, if you're discussing some sort of journal article like Chris, mentions, you're talking about that in your class. And then you have a surprise Zoom session where the author, makes an appearance. The students would love that, and that's I think that's a creative way to do that. And so for me, I guess one of the big takeaways from all of this is, although the pandemic has just been terrible, the fact that we are able to connect more because of these online platforms, I think is really a positive, and this is a way that we can possibly do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really creative and important suggestion that you've made there, is thinking about how we can take the lessons from the pandemic to kind of improve the quality of education and our larger goals around these issues. That's really good. Well, I think we're kind of creeping into the next hour here, and I think folks are dropping off with their other commitments, but I just want to express my sincere gratitude to you, Dr. Collins, for this really exciting and informative and important discussion that we've had here today. So thank you very much. Let's all react in the Zoom.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it to be able to visit virtually today. You guys have a wonderful day.
All right. Thank you. You too. And thanks everybody for attending. Appreciate it.